before a crown was seized at Hastings, before a kingdom was reshaped in stone and law, before the name William the Conqueror became a legend whispered through the ages, there was a boy of uncertain birth, born in a fortress above a river in a land forged by steel and salt air. This is not the story of a man who stumbled into power. It is the story of a survivor, a strategist, a ruler who learned early that to hold power, one must never show weakness. And to understand William, to understand the man who would change England forever, we must begin in Normandy, nearly 1,000 years ago. In the early 10th century, the western coast of what is now France was a place of fear. Long ships with curved prows cut through the mist of the Seine and the Loire, their dragon-headed bows striking terror into the hearts of townsfolk and monks. The Norsemen had come, not just to raid, but to stay. They came from the cold fjords of Norway and Denmark, drawn by the promise of fertile land and rich plunder. They descended upon monasteries and villages, torching what they could not carry, taking captives, seizing wealth. For decades, the Franks tried to resist, but the longships kept coming. Then, in the year 911, an agreement was struck that would change the map of Europe. A Viking warlord named Rollo, towering in stature and feared in battle, made peace with Charles the Simple, king of the West Franks. The Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte granted Rollo and his men a swath of land at the mouth of the Seine. In return, the Norsemen would defend these lands from other raiders and embrace the Christian faith. It was a gamble for both sides. For the Franks, it was an admission that the Vikings could not be driven away, only integrated. For Rollo and his followers, it was a transformation. They laid down their pagan gods, took up the cross, and began to weave themselves into the fabric of Frankish society. But they did not lose their spirit. The land they settled became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen, and its rulers, the Dukes of Normandy, would keep alive the ferocity of their Viking blood, even as they mastered the arts of statecraft. Over the next century, the descendants of Rollo transformed their duchy into one of the most formidable states in Europe. They embraced the feudal system, dividing land among loyal knights who, in return, offered military service. They built stone keeps and walled towns, fortresses that dotted the rivers and guarded the roads. But they also adapted. The Normans learned the language of their neighbors, a rough blend of Old Norse and Old French that would become the Norman tongue. They studied the laws and customs of the Franks. They traded across the Channel with England and deep into the heart of the continent. Normandy's warriors became renowned for their discipline. While other armies still relied heavily on infantry, the Normans excelled at mounted warfare. Their knights, armored in chainmail, wielding lances from horseback, were feared across Europe. Their cavalry charges could shatter enemy lines, and their reputation as relentless fighters grew with every campaign. By the dawn of the 11th century, Normandy was not merely a duchy, it was a rising power, and at its heart was a culture that prized both strength and cunning. Here, a leader could not simply inherit loyalty, he had to command it. And it was into this world that William was born. In the year 1028, in the fortress town of Falaise, a boy came into the world who would one day shake the foundations of kingdoms. His father was Robert I, Duke of Normandy, known as Robert the Magnificent. His mother was Herleva, the daughter of a local tanner. Their union was never sanctified by marriage. Robert may have loved Herleva, but in the eyes of the church, their child was illegitimate. This was no small matter. In the politics of medieval Europe, legitimacy was more than a moral concern. It was a question of succession, of whether a claim to rule could be recognized without dispute. The boy was christened William, but from the start, he carried a burden in his very name: William the Bastard. Still, his early years were not without privilege. He grew up surrounded by the symbols of power, the stone walls of Falaise Castle, the banners of Norman knights, the clatter of armor in the courtyards. He learned to ride before he was tall enough to see over the saddle. He listened to tales of Rollo and the Viking forebears who had carved Normandy out of chaos. He absorbed the lessons of loyalty and betrayal long before he understood their full meaning. In 1035, William was still a boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, when his world shifted forever. His father, Duke Robert, decided to undertake a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Such a journey was perilous in the extreme, yet Robert seemed determined to cleanse his soul in the holiest of lands. Before departing, Robert called his vassals to a gathering. There, he announced that his only heir would be William, his son by Herleva, despite his illegitimacy. This was a gamble. Naming a child, and a bastard at that, as the ruler of one of Europe's most powerful duchies was certain to invite unrest. Robert's pilgrimage was the last time Normandy would see its duke alive. Somewhere on the long, treacherous road back from Jerusalem, he died, likely from illness, though some whispered darker causes. His body never returned to Normandy. What did return was a crisis. William, barely old enough to understand the weight of his inheritance, was now Duke of Normandy. He had no mother of noble rank to protect him at court, and no father to enforce his claim. Around him swirled a storm of ambition. The Norman barons, powerful in their own right, saw opportunity in the boy's youth. The duchy became a chessboard, where knights and lords moved pieces not in loyalty to their young duke, but for their own gain. Castles changed hands. Oaths were broken as easily as they were sworn. The regency that ruled in William's name was fragile. One by one, the men appointed to safeguard his reign met violent ends, assassinated in the night, cut down in sudden ambushes. Even the Archbishop of Rouen, one of William's early protectors, could not hold back the tide of lawlessness. Normandy was descending into anarchy, and at the center of it all was a boy marked for death. In these years, William's survival was nothing short of miraculous. Time and again, plots arose to kill him. Twice he fled in the night, guided by loyal servants who risked their lives to keep him alive. The walls of Falaise, once a fortress of safety, could no longer be trusted. His mother, Herleva, had by then remarried a Norman noble, William de Conqueror, and moved to a new life. Though she remained an emotional presence, William grew to understand that in politics, blood ties could not always be counted upon for protection. Those who remained loyal to the boy duke were few but fiercely devoted. Men like Gilbert of Brienne, who acted as guardian until his murder, and Osborne the steward, who was slain in William's very bedchamber as the boy slept nearby. William learned early that danger could come even when the doors were barred. This constant threat hardened him. The boy absorbed lessons most men would never learn in a lifetime: whom to trust, when to act, and when to wait. He learned to measure words like a blade, and to wear silence as a shield. By his early teens, William was not just a child of Normandy, he was a survivor of Normandy. By the age of 15, William had begun to assert himself not merely as a figurehead, but as a ruler in his own right. The turning point came in a series of rebellions led by barons who still saw him as an easy target. One such confrontation, the siege of Alençon, would cement William's reputation for ruthless decisiveness. The men of Alençon, seeking to humiliate him, taunted the young duke about his birth, hanging animal hides from the town walls in reference to his mother's family trade. William's response was swift and brutal. When the town fell, he ordered the hands and feet of the ringleaders cut off, a punishment both savage and symbolic. The message was clear. Insults to the duke's name would be answered in blood. This was the moment Normandy began to see William not as a boy to be manipulated, but as a man to be feared. By the age of 15, William had begun to assert himself not merely as a figurehead, but as a ruler in his own right. The turning point came in a series of rebellions led by barons who still saw him as an easy target. One such confrontation, the Siege of Alençon, would cement William's reputation for ruthless decisiveness. The men of Alençon, seeking to humiliate him, taunted the young duke about his birth, hanging animal hides from the town walls in reference to his mother's family trade. William's response was swift and brutal. When the town fell, he ordered the hands and feet of the ringleaders cut off, a punishment both savage and symbolic. The message was clear. Insults to the duke's name would be answered in blood. This was the moment Normandy began to see William not as a boy to be manipulated, but as a man to be feared. Over the next decade, William tightened his grip on Normandy. He demanded loyalty from his vassals, rewarding the faithful and crushing the treacherous. His armies grew stronger, drilled in the art of cavalry warfare. Castles, once nests of rebellion, became bastions of ducal power. He also sought allies beyond his borders. His marriage to Matilda of Flanders, the daughter of Count Baldwin V, forged a powerful alliance with one of the most influential territories in Northern Europe. The union not only brought military and political support, but also elevated William's standing among Europe's ruling elite. By the early 1050s, Normandy was stable, prosperous, and feared. The days of assassination plots and runaway knights were over. William, once a hunted boy, was now the master of his duchy. But the ambitions of such a man rarely stop at his own borders. Across the Channel, in the Kingdom of England, the stage was being set for one of the most famous conquests in history. Yet before the sails could be raised, before the first arrow could fly, William had already fought and won the first great battle of his life, the battle to rule Normandy. Normandy in the late 1040 was a land transformed. The boy duke who had once been hunted through the shadows now rode at the head of his own armies. But survival was only the first step. William had learned in his youth that a title meant nothing without the power to defend it. Now, as a young man in his 20s, William's task was not merely to keep his duchy, but to make it stronger than it had ever been. And in this, he would prove relentless. In the aftermath of his early victories over rebellious barons, William began a deliberate campaign to secure the loyalty of his nobility. He understood that fear alone could hold men for a time, but fear without reward bred only more rebellion. He began to grant lands and titles to those who had stood by him during the chaos of his youth. Not the old families who had tried to manipulate him, but a new generation of knights and lords whose fortunes depended entirely on his favor. These men were not only bound to William by oath, they were bound by gratitude. And in the brutal mathematics of medieval politics, gratitude and ambition could be more enduring than blood. Records from this time show William consolidating his power through carefully arranged marriages among his vassals, placing loyal men in control of strategically vital castles. Stone by stone, oath by oath, Normandy was being reforged into a weapon, with William as its hilt and blade. In the year 1051, William made a move that would alter not only his own fortunes, but also the political balance of Northern Europe. He sought the hand of Matilda of Flanders, daughter of Count Baldwin V, one of the most influential rulers in the region. This was no simple courtship. Baldwin's court was a center of wealth, culture, and military power. The marriage would unite Normandy with Flanders, creating a formidable alliance. But the path to the wedding was not without obstacles. The Pope himself initially opposed the union, citing distant blood relations between William and Matilda. Yet William was nothing if not determined. In time, the church relented, and the marriage was sealed. Matilda was no passive bride. She was intelligent, politically astute, and fiercely loyal. She would become one of William's closest advisors, managing Normandy in his absence and lending her own considerable influence to his ambitions. Together, they would raise a family that would intertwine with the destiny of both Normandy and England. Even with powerful allies, William's hold on Normandy was not uncontested. Rival lords, some with blood ties to the ducal family, continued to challenge him. One of the most significant threats came in 1047, when a coalition of Norman barons rose against him, supported by King Henry I of France himself, a monarch who feared William's growing strength. The rebellion culminated in the Battle of Hastings. The fighting was fierce. William, fighting alongside his former enemy King Henry, who had temporarily allied with him against the rebels, led his knights in a decisive cavalry charge. The rebel forces were driven into the River Orne, where many drowned in the chaos of retreat. The victory was more than a battlefield triumph. It was a signal to all of Normandy that William was not merely defending his title. He was shaping the duchy into a force that could stand against kings. William's genius was not only in battle. He understood that true power required more than swords. It required stability. He strengthened the ducal administration, expanding the use of written records to keep track of landholdings and obligations. He insisted on uniform justice, bringing rebellious lords to heel through ducal courts, rather than endless cycles of private vengeance. Castles were rebuilt or reinforced, not as private strongholds of barons, but as extensions of ducal authority. Towns were encouraged to grow around these fortresses, becoming centers of trade and taxation. By centralizing authority, William was doing something rare for his time, turning a feudal duchy into a unified state under a single commanding ruler. On the battlefield, William perfected the Norman way of war. His armies were built around the shock power of the mounted knight, heavily armored warriors whose lances could break an enemy line in a single charge. But he also understood the value of combined arms. Norman infantry, disciplined and drilled, could hold the line while archers softened enemy formations from a distance. These tactics, honed in Normandy, would one day be unleashed with devastating effect on the fields of England. In this period, William also invested in siege warfare, a science in its own right. Trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers became tools of Norman dominance. A castle wall was no longer an impregnable defense when William's engineers went to work. William's growing power inevitably drew the attention and suspicion of his neighbors. The King of France, once an occasional ally, began to fear the ambition of the Norman Duke. Likewise, the powerful Count of Anjou saw Normandy as both a rival and a prize. The result was a series of border conflicts and shifting alliances, in which William demonstrated his talent for playing his enemies against each other. He could fight when necessary, but he also knew when to negotiate, when to stall for time, and when to strike with overwhelming force. By the mid-1050s, Normandy was at peace, not the peace of weakness, but the peace of dominance. William's authority was uncontested within his borders. His alliances stretched across northern Europe. His armies were disciplined, loyal, and battle-tested. The boy who had once fled assassins in the night now commanded one of the most powerful states in Christendom. And across the Channel, in England, the old King Edward the Confessor ruled without an heir. The eyes of William of Normandy began to turn toward the English crown. In the middle of the 11th century, England was a kingdom of contrasts, a land both ancient and young. Its roots reached deep into the mists of the Anglo-Saxon age, yet its unity was barely a century old, forged in the crucible of war against Viking raiders. To the north lay the wild lands of Scotland, to the west, the mountains of Wales, and to the south, across a narrow, restless sea, the kingdoms and duchies of continental Europe. England was an island realm, but it was never truly isolated. Ships from Normandy, Flanders, Denmark, and Norway crossed its harbors daily. Merchants carried silks and wine from distant lands, while pilgrims and envoys brought news of politics and wars from across Christendom. It was here, in a land of green fields, timber halls, and sacred stone churches, that the stage was set for one of the most famous struggles for power in history. The House of Wessex had long fought to unite the English kingdoms. A century earlier, Alfred the Great had defended his people against the great heathen army of the Vikings, laying the foundation for a unified England. His descendants carried forward that work, though the crown often passed through turmoil, battle, and intrigue. By the time Edward the Confessor ascended to the throne in 1042, England had endured decades of Danish domination under King Canute and his sons. Edward was a Wessex king by blood, but much of his life had been spent far from England, in exile at the Norman court. This exile would shape him. Edward absorbed the customs, language, and politics of Normandy, developing friendships with Norman nobles and clerics. When he returned to rule England, he brought with him a taste for Norman advisors, architecture, and the church reforms of the continent, changes that would unsettle many of his English subjects. Anglo-Saxon England was built on a rigid social hierarchy. At the top stood the king, the symbolic protector of the realm and the ultimate source of law. Beneath him were the great earls, powerful nobles who ruled vast regions with near-royal authority. Below the earls came the thegns, the backbone of local governance and military service. Then the ceorls, the free farmers who worked the land and owed taxes and service to their lords. At the bottom were the thralls, or slaves, men and women who were property, often taken in war or born into bondage. The king did not rule alone. The witan, a council of nobles and church leaders, advised the crown, debated laws, and played a crucial role in selecting the next monarch. Kingship was not purely hereditary. The witan's approval was essential, and their choice could defy bloodline. England, in the mid-11th century, was one of the richest realms in Europe. Its fertile soils yielded abundant harvests. Its towns thrived on trade in wool, tin, and salt. The silver penny was among the most stable currencies in Christendom. The church was both a spiritual and political force. Monasteries dotted the countryside, centers of learning and record-keeping. Bishops wielded influence not just in the pulpit, but in the king's council. And the building of great stone churches, inspired by continental styles, spoke of both devotion and wealth. The defense of the realm rested on the fyrd, a militia drawn from the free men of each shire. When called, they brought their own weapons, spears, shields, and axes, serving for a set period before returning to their fields. The professional corps of the army consisted of the king's housecarls, elite warriors armed with fearsome two-handed axes. They were well-trained, disciplined, and loyal, forming a shield wall that could hold against almost any charge. England's navy, though modest compared to Viking fleets of old, was capable of guarding the coast against raids, at least in theory. But by the mid-11th century, complacency had begun to creep in. Few in England suspected that an invasion could come not from the north, but from across the southern sea. If Edward was king in name, the most powerful man in England in practice was Earl Godwin of Wessex. A shrewd and ambitious noble, Godwin controlled vast lands and commanded the loyalty of thousands. His influence extended into every corner of the kingdom. His son, Harold Godwinson, was as capable in war as he was in politics. Over the years, Harold became Edward's most trusted commander, leading campaigns in Wales and negotiating with foreign rulers. By the early 1060s, Harold was the dominant figure in the English nobility, the man many saw as the kingdom's natural leader after Edward. The great shadow over Edward's reign was the absence of an heir. His marriage to Edith, Godwin's daughter, produced no children. As Edward aged, the question of succession became more urgent and more dangerous. Different factions put forward different claimants. Some favored Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in the land. Others looked to the exiled descendants of earlier kings, and across the Channel, William of Normandy believed he had been promised the crown by Edward himself. Normandy and England were bound by trade, blood, and politics. Norman knights already served in Edward's court. Norman bishops were appointed to English sees. The cultural influence was undeniable and resented by some Anglo-Saxon nobles. According to Norman chroniclers, Harold Godwinson once traveled to Normandy and swore an oath to support William's claim to the English throne. English sources dispute this, but the story would later become a central justification for William's invasion. Whether the oath was real or not, by the early 1060s, the winds of ambition were blowing hard across the Channel. By 1065, England seemed stable on the surface, wealthy, united, and at peace. But beneath, rivalries were sharpening like blades. The death of Edward the Confessor, whenever it came, would open a race for the crown unlike anything the kingdom had ever seen. The final years of Edward's reign would be marked by tension, suspicion, and a growing sense that the kingdom was heading toward a reckoning. And when that reckoning came, it would not be decided in the council chambers of Westminster, but on the blood-soaked fields of battle. The summer of 1066 had been one of restless anticipation in Normandy. For months, William, Duke of Normandy, had been assembling a force unlike anything seen in the region's history, a war machine of knights, infantry, and archers drawn from across Normandy and beyond. His ambition was immense. His claim to the throne of England was absolute, at least in his own mind, and his willingness to risk everything, his life, his duchy, his reputation, was unmatched. Yet the Channel winds would not obey him. The fleet, hundreds of ships strong, lay waiting along the Norman coast. Rows of masts bobbed in the water like a forest of sharpened spears. The summer sun baked the sand and shingle beaches, while the cries of gulls echoed over the waves. Soldiers drilled daily. Armor was polished until it caught the light like fire. War horses were fed and trained, their breath steaming in the early mornings. Blacksmiths worked endlessly, the ring of hammers carrying on the sea breeze. But day after day, the winds blew from the wrong direction. To cross the English Channel from Normandy to the shores of Sussex, William needed a favorable wind, a southern breeze to carry his fleet northwards. Instead, a stubborn north wind pinned him to the coast. For weeks the Duke's army waited. Some grew restless, others whispered about omens. Was God delaying their passage? Was the invasion cursed before it began? But William would not be swayed by superstition. He ordered the army to remain ready at a moment's notice. Across the Channel, Harold Godwinson, crowned King of England in January of that year, was preparing for war of his own. He knew William would come. The Norman Duke had sent him word, accusing Harold of breaking his oath, an oath Harold had sworn years earlier, promising to support William's claim to the English throne. Harold denied its legitimacy. His crown, he claimed, came by the will of Edward the Confessor and the consent of the English nobility. Throughout the summer, Harold kept his army on high alert, positioned along the southern coast, ready to repel the Norman landing. But like William, he was at the mercy of the winds, or rather, the lack of Norman sails on the horizon. By late August, Harold's provisions were dwindling. Maintaining a large standing army was expensive and logistically difficult in the 11th century. Peasant levies could not be kept from their farms indefinitely. The harvest was coming. Believing perhaps that William might delay until the following year, Harold disbanded much of his army, sending men home to gather crops. It was a decision that would prove costly. Far to the north, another danger was approaching. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, a warrior of legendary reputation, who claimed the English throne through an earlier promise made to his predecessor. With a fleet of 300 ships, Hardrada sailed for England, intent on seizing the crown. When Harold Godwinson received word of the Norwegian invasion, he had no choice. He marched his housecarls and newly gathered levies north at breakneck speed. In a matter of days, the English king covered nearly 200 miles, reaching Yorkshire to meet the threat head-on. At Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, Harold won a stunning victory, shattering Hardrada's forces and killing the Norwegian king. But it was a costly triumph. His men were exhausted, bloodied, and many had fallen. They would have little time to rest. In Normandy, William received the news like a sign from heaven. The north wind that had kept him trapped for weeks suddenly shifted. Now it blew from the south, the perfect wind to carry him across the Channel. William acted instantly. Trumpets blared through the camp. Soldiers scrambled to their assigned ships. Priests moved among them, offering blessings and hearing confessions. Standards bearing the papal banner, a gift from Pope Alexander II, signifying the Church's support for William's cause, fluttered in the wind. The fleet slipped from the Norman coast under a pale moon. Lanterns glowed like fireflies on the decks. The sea was calm, the wind steady. For hours they sailed in the darkness, the rhythmic slap of waves against wooden hulls their only sound. By dawn, the Sussex coast came into view. William's ships beached at Pevensey Bay on September 28, 1066. The Duke was among the first ashore, leaping from his ship, and in a curious moment recorded by chroniclers, stumbling and falling face first into the sand. A murmur spread through the ranks. Was this a bad omen? But William, quick-witted and confident, rose with a handful of English soil in his grasp. "I have taken hold of the land with both hands," he declared. The men cheered. The Normans wasted no time. They built a wooden fort inside the ruins of an old Roman fort at Pevensey, securing their landing site. Soon after, they moved east to Hastings, establishing a second fortified base. The camp at Hastings became the beating heart of William's invasion. Supplies were unloaded, horses brought ashore, weapons organized. Scouts fanned out into the countryside, raiding for food and assessing the terrain. William knew Harold would come. He also knew the English king was far to the north, dealing with the Norwegian invasion. But he could not wait indefinitely. Prolonged delay could allow Harold to regroup and rally more forces. When Harold learned of the Norman landing, he moved with astonishing speed. Just days after Stamford Bridge, his army, weary, bruised, and short on rest, began the forced march south. It was an extraordinary feat of endurance, but it came at a price. The men would arrive at Hastings tired, with little time to prepare for battle. On the night of October 13th, 1066, the two armies faced each other across the rolling hills near Hastings. In the Norman camp, William's men feasted and sang, priests walking among them with blessings. In the English camp, Harold's troops slept in the open air, their king walking among them, speaking words of encouragement. Dawn was approaching, and with it, one of the most decisive battles in English history. Dawn, October the 14th, in the year of our Lord, 1066. The mists cling low upon the rolling hills of Sussex. Dew dampens the grass, and the air is thick with the scent of earth and fear. Two armies stand poised to decide the fate of a kingdom. Two leaders, each convinced of his right to the English crown. Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, and William, Duke of Normandy, soon to be known to history as the Conqueror. The Battle of Hastings did not begin as a sudden clash. It began as a day foretold. For weeks, William had planned every detail, from the timing of his landing at Pevensey to the carefully orchestrated march toward London. He sought not just a fight, but the fight. The single encounter that would settle the question of England's throne. At first light, the Anglo-Saxon host took its position on a high ridge just north of Hastings, known to later generations as Senlac Hill. Harold's army, though battered from their forced march south after the battle at Stamford Bridge, still presented a formidable sight. Thousands of housecarls, professional warriors clad in mail, their long-handled axes gleaming in the pale sun, and a much larger levy of the fyrd, farmers and townsmen called to defend their homeland. They formed a shield wall, an impenetrable living fortress. Each man's shield overlapped the next, a wall of wood and iron meant to absorb the shock of Norman cavalry and repel the rain of arrows they knew would come. Down below, on the slope's southern approach, William's host arrayed itself in 3 divisions. On his left, troops from Brittany under Alan the Red. On the right, warriors from France and Flanders. At the center, William's own Normans, the backbone of his army, a mixture of infantry, archers, and the fearsome Norman knights on horseback. The Duke rode before his men, his face set with grim determination. He reminded them of their cause, of the oath Harold had sworn to him years before, and of the Pope's blessing upon their enterprise. Behind the banners of Normandy and the papal standard, William's men saw not just a battlefield before them, but the promise of new lands, titles, and eternal salvation. The morning began with the whistling hiss of arrows. Norman archers advanced, loosing volleys high into the air, their shafts arcing over the heads of their own troops toward the waiting English. But Harold's shield wall held firm. The arrows thudded into oak, splintering harmlessly, or glanced off mail and helms. Then came the infantry. The Norman foot soldiers advanced up the slope, shields raised, spears thrusting, but the incline worked against them. The Saxons stood above, gravity and position lending strength to every axe blow. The first assault broke against Harold's wall like waves against a cliff. William's knights now took their turn. Horses snorted and pawed at the ground as the signal was given. In a thunder of hooves they charged uphill, lances poised. The sound was deafening. The ground itself seemed to tremble. But again, the Saxon shield wall held. Horses balked at the solid wall of spears, knights were unseated, and the slope robbed them of the momentum needed to break through. The first hour had passed, and still the English line remained unbroken. The Normans pulled back to regroup, their initial confidence dented by the stubborn defense. It was then that William employed one of the most famous stratagems in medieval warfare. Whether planned from the start or improvised in the moment, remains debated by historians. On the Norman left, the Bretons, facing heavy resistance, began to fall back. At first it was a retreat, but as the English on the ridge saw their enemy give way, many broke formation to pursue them down the slope. This was their fatal mistake. Once the pursuing Saxons were far enough from their main line, the Norman horsemen wheeled about. The retreat became a trap. The isolated English were cut down. Their line weakened. Word of this maneuver spread, and it would be repeated throughout the day, each time luring more Saxons to their doom. At one critical moment, word spread among the Normans that William had been slain. Panic threatened to spread, but the Duke, sensing the danger, rode to the front, tore off his helmet, and shouted, "Look at me, I live! And with God's help, I will conquer yet!" His presence steadied the men, and the fighting resumed with renewed vigor. As the afternoon waned, the shield wall began to falter. Exhaustion set in, and gaps appeared. Norman archers, now adjusting their aim to fire directly into the ranks rather than over them, found their mark. The exact moment of King Harold's death is shrouded in legend. The Bayeux Tapestry shows a figure, struck in the eye by an arrow, collapsing beneath the Norman advance. Others claim he was cut down by Norman knights. Whatever the truth, by late afternoon, the English king lay dead, his banner, the fighting man, trampled into the blood-soaked earth. With their leader fallen, the Anglo-Saxon army broke. Some fled into the woods, others were hunted down by the Norman cavalry. By nightfall, the ridge was littered with the dead, noble and common alike. The field of Hastings had decided England's fate. In the silence after battle, William stood amidst the ruin. He had won not just a crown, but a kingdom, though it was a prize that would demand blood and iron to hold. The road to London still lay ahead, and the land he had claimed would not yield without further struggle. But on that October day, the Norman Duke had taken the first step toward becoming William the Conqueror. The sun set on October 14th, 1066, casting long shadows over a kingdom forever altered. The fields near Hastings were drenched in blood, strewn with the fallen, Anglo-Saxon and Norman alike. Harold Godwinson lay dead, his crown stripped from his head, and his kingdom left vulnerable to a foreign conqueror. But victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. For William, the fight to secure the crown of England had only just begun. The Norman army was weary, but William's resolve was unshaken. He knew that seizing the throne required more than martial success. It demanded swift control over England's political heart. William moved quickly, capturing key coastal towns to secure supply lines. Hastings was a start, but it was only a foothold. The English south coast was dotted with fortified settlements, Pevensey, Dover, Romney, all vital to controlling movement and communication. The Normans rebuilt and reinforced old Roman forts and earthworks, establishing castles that would stand as symbols of Norman power and deterrence against rebellion. Winter was coming, and William knew time was of the essence. His army, though victorious, was still a foreign force in hostile territory. Slowly and carefully, William led his forces northwest toward London, the seat of English power. Along the way, he faced resistance from English nobles loyal to the memory of Harold and the old ways. Several towns attempted to resist Norman authority. At Wallingford, Berkhamsted, and Windsor, William's forces laid siege or threatened the populace, often prompting surrender without bloodshed, but always making clear that resistance would be costly. The journey was as much psychological warfare as military conquest, a display of unstoppable Norman will. On December 25, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, a moment as symbolic as it was practical. The ceremony was designed to legitimize his rule not only through conquest, but through divine sanction. The Archbishop of York crowned William in the presence of bishops, nobles, and foreign dignitaries, while the papal banner flew outside as a sign of the Church's approval. This act sent a clear message. William was now the lawful ruler of England, chosen by God and recognized by the Church. Yet, William's grip was far from secure. Discontent simmered throughout the kingdom, erupting in rebellions particularly in the north and east. Anglo-Saxon nobles, resentful of Norman rule and the displacement of their lands, raised arms in revolt. In response, William unleashed a campaign of brutal repression known as the Harrying of the North. Villages were razed, crops burned, and many died from famine and violence. This scorched earth policy was designed to break resistance once and for all, leaving a landscape scarred but a realm subdued. With the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy displaced, William began redistributing lands to his Norman followers. A new feudal system took root. Land was held directly from the king in exchange for military service and loyalty. Castles dotted the landscape, garrisoned by Norman lords who owed allegiance to William alone. This reshaped England's social and political structure, binding it to the continent and altering centuries-old traditions. William's castles were more than military strongholds. They were centers of administration and symbols of Norman dominance. The Tower of London, begun in 1078, would become the most famous, a fortress, royal palace, and prison rolled into one. From stone keeps to Motte and Bailey designs, castles secured Norman control over England's lands and people, projecting power from every hilltop and river crossing. Over time, England began to change under Norman rule. The English language would evolve as Norman French blended with Anglo-Saxon. Architecture shifted from timber to stone. The Church saw reforms inspired by continental Europe. While some traditions persisted, the Norman conquest marked the beginning of a new England, one connected more closely to Europe, shaped by feudalism, chivalry, and a new ruling elite. By the end of William's reign, the conquest had transformed England irrevocably. Though the road was long and fraught with conflict, William established a dynasty that would last centuries. But shadows remained. Uprisings flared, rival claimants surfaced, and the kingdom wrestled with its new identity. William's story was not just of conquest, but of securing a crown and forging a kingdom, forever changed by the man who crossed the channel to claim it. The crown was won in battle, but secured in fire, stone, and law. William the Conqueror had changed England forever, a king who reshaped a nation's destiny, his legacy echoing through the ages. The Norman conquest did not end on the battlefield at Hastings. It was only the beginning. What followed was a profound transformation, a reweaving of the very fabric of English society, law, language, and land. William the Conqueror and his followers would build a new kingdom, brick by brick, stone by stone, law by law, forever changing the face of England. In 1085, nearly 2 decades after Hastings, William commissioned a monumental undertaking, the Domesday Book. An exhaustive survey unlike anything the medieval world had seen, it catalogued every manor, every villager, every resource throughout England. Its purpose was clear: to assess the wealth of the kingdom and to ensure William's tax revenues were secure. This vast ledger revealed the transformation underway. The vast estates once held by Anglo-Saxon nobles, now controlled by Norman lords. The Domesday Book was a mirror, reflecting the new order, a kingdom meticulously organized under the rule of the conqueror. Norman rule introduced a new system of governance. William appointed trusted Norman sheriffs and officials to oversee local justice, taxes, and law enforcement. The Witan, once the council of Anglo-Saxon nobles, was supplanted by a more centralized royal court, governed by Norman principles. English common law began to intertwine with Norman customs, setting the foundation for centuries of English jurisprudence. At the heart of this transformation was feudalism, a hierarchical system of landholding based on service and loyalty. William granted vast tracts of land to his Norman barons, knights, and followers, binding them in service to the crown. In turn, these lords controlled the Anglo-Saxon peasants, who worked the fields as tenants or serfs. The old Anglo-Saxon nobility was displaced, their influence diminished or extinguished. This system created a network of mutual obligation, a rigid but stable social order that dominated medieval England. Normans introduced a revolution in architecture. The wooden motte and bailey castles of early conquest soon gave way to imposing stone keeps. These castles served as military strongholds, administrative centers, and symbols of Norman authority. The Tower of London, begun under William's son, would become the most iconic, a fortress dominating the city and the River Thames. At the same time, Norman cathedrals rose across England: Durham, Canterbury, Winchester, blending Romanesque grandeur with English tradition. These grand structures were centers of worship, learning, and power, built to impress and inspire. The Norman elite spoke a dialect of Old French, which became the language of the court, the law, and literature. English, the language of the conquered, survived but was profoundly influenced, absorbing thousands of French words, particularly relating to governance, law, art, and cuisine. This linguistic fusion would give birth to Middle English, the ancestor of the language spoken today. Norman culture influenced fashion, art, and education. Monastic centers flourished, copying manuscripts and fostering learning. The church was a key agent of cultural transmission. William replaced Anglo-Saxon bishops with Normans loyal to him and Rome. He supported the Gregorian reform movement, aligning the English church with continental Europe. Monasticism expanded, with new abbeys founded or reformed. These religious centers became hubs of spirituality, scholarship, and economic power. The church also helped legitimize Norman rule, preaching loyalty to the king as God's chosen ruler. England's economy gradually expanded. Markets grew in towns, trade routes flourished, and new agricultural techniques improved productivity. Norman rulers encouraged the development of towns, boroughs, granting charters and privileges to merchants. Yet beneath progress lay tension. The Anglo-Saxon peasantry found themselves under Norman lords, adjusting to new customs, taxes, and laws. Occasional revolts erupted, but over time, Norman authority was accepted or endured. By the end of William's reign, England had been irrevocably changed. The Norman conquest was not just a military victory, but a deep social, cultural, and political transformation. The foundations of the medieval English state were laid, strong, centralized, and intertwined with continental Europe. William the Conqueror's legacy was a New England, born of conquest but forged in stone, law, and language, a kingdom that would endure through centuries. The story of England's transformation is a story of resilience and adaptation, of conquest and culture intertwined, of a kingdom reborn, shaped by the ambitions of one man, but carried forward by generations to come. Nearly 2 decades after the thunderous clash of Hastings, England lay transformed, a kingdom reshaped by conquest, governance, and the relentless will of one man, William the Conqueror. But to truly control this new realm, William needed more than castles and armies. He needed knowledge, the intimate details of every manor, every village, every subject. So, in the year 1085, he decreed a survey unparalleled in medieval history, a record so comprehensive that it would forever change how England was ruled. This was the birth of the Domesday Book. William understood the medieval world's precariousness. Kingship was power, but power without knowledge was fragile. The previous 2 decades had been marked by rebellion, resistance, and uncertainty. The new Norman lords were powerful, but their loyalty required oversight. Taxes were owed to the crown, but collection was uneven and disputed. William's solution was radical: map his kingdom down to the last acre. Know every tenant, every resource, every obligation. He wanted a ledger of truth, an accounting of wealth and men, so precise and authoritative that no noble or peasant could dispute it. Royal officials and sheriffs began organizing their counties, notifying landholders and the populace. The sheer scale was staggering. England was divided into shires. Hundreds of manors dotted the landscape, and tens of thousands of people lived under this patchwork of lordship. Local leaders were summoned to courts, where they would answer questions posed by royal commissioners, men with authority backed by the king himself. The word spread: truth must be told, or face consequences. The Domesday Book was no mere record. It was a statement of royal supremacy. William dispatched teams of commissioners throughout the kingdom. These men were the king's eyes and ears, skilled in gathering testimony, weighing claims, and recording details with painstaking accuracy. They questioned lords, reeves, villagers, and sometimes even the poor. Witnesses were called to verify land boundaries, previous ownership, and production capacity. Often disputes arose, memories conflicted, claims overlapped, but the commissioners' decisions were final. In each shire, the process followed a rigorous pattern. The commissioner would summon local officials and landholders to a royal court. Questions covered land ownership, size, agricultural output, livestock, mills, fisheries, and any dues owed to the lord or crown. The state of the land before 1066 was carefully recorded, a nod to the reign of King Edward the Confessor, the benchmark for change. The current status was documented, noting if land was wasted or productive. This dual comparison revealed not only wealth, but the impact of the Norman conquest itself: land deserted due to war, rebellion, or destruction. The survey revealed vast shifts in power. Norman lords now held the lion's share of England's land, displacing most Anglo-Saxon nobility. Many estates lay desolate, a legacy of the brutal harrying of the North and other suppression campaigns. Yet pockets of Anglo-Saxon landholders remained, usually those who submitted early or proved useful to Norman governance. The Domesday Book was a mirror of conquest and continuity, a kingdom transformed but still tethered to its past. William used the book as a tool for governance, to settle disputes over land ownership that otherwise could spark violence, to set taxation rates with unprecedented precision, to reinforce feudal obligations, ensuring every lord knew their duties and rights. The Domesday Survey strengthened royal courts by providing indisputable evidence and a central reference. It marked a move toward a centralized bureaucratic state, a novelty in medieval Europe. With knowledge came power. William and his trusted sheriffs enforced laws across the shires. Castles became administrative hubs, as well as military fortresses, controlling local populations and deterring rebellion. Loyalty was enforced through a system of oaths and duties, binding the barons and knights directly to the king. The new feudal order took deeper root, replacing older Anglo-Saxon traditions with Norman law and governance. The Domesday Survey also reflected social realities. Peasants, villeins, and serfs labored under new lords, their lives transformed by Norman rule. Markets and towns began to grow as Norman policies favored trade and stability. Agricultural practices evolved, and population centers shifted, setting the stage for medieval England's economic expansion. With order secured, England's economy stabilized. Markets grew, towns flourished, and trade routes extended. Agricultural production increased, and new techniques spread. William's governance laid the groundwork for prosperity that would sustain England for generations. Yet challenges remained. Some Anglo-Saxon nobles chafed under Norman rule, and pockets of resistance flared, especially in the north. William's successors would inherit these challenges, but under his reign, the kingdom held firm. The Domesday Book stands as a testament to William's vision and authority. A monumental record, it remains a window into medieval England, its people, its wealth, its power. More than a book, it was a tool of governance, and a symbol of a king's unyielding grip on his realm. William the Conqueror's legacy was not merely forged on the battlefield. It was inked in parchment, measured in fields, and carved into the very laws of a nation. Through Domesday, he transformed England from a land of fractured loyalties into a kingdom bound by order, law, and the king's unyielding gaze. His reign was the dawn of medieval England as we know it, a legacy that echoes through time. As the years passed, the fierce warrior who had crossed the Channel to seize a kingdom grew older. William the Conqueror, now King of England and Duke of Normandy, faced the twilight of his reign amid political intrigue, rebellion, and personal turmoil. His final years would test the strength of the kingdom he forged and the legacy he intended to leave behind. Though crowned king nearly 20 years earlier, William never ceased to rule with iron will. He continued to travel between England and Normandy, overseeing justice, reinforcing castles, and ensuring loyalty among his barons. His administrative reforms deepened, and the realm grew more stable, but the challenges of ruling two lands, separated by the sea, remained ever present. William's family life was complex and fraught with tension. He had several sons, Robert, William Rufus, and Henry, each ambitious and at times rebellious. The question of succession weighed heavily on the aging king. He sought to divide his holdings in a way that would secure his dynasty: Normandy to Robert, England to William Rufus, and a future for Henry. Yet this division planted the seeds of future conflict, as his sons vied for power. William's later reign was marked by revolts. Noble factions in both England and Normandy chafed under his rule, sparking uprisings that required swift and often brutal response. Notable rebellions included those led by his own son Robert, as well as English barons uneasy with Norman control. William's military campaigns against these rebels demonstrated his enduring vigor and tactical acumen, even in old age. In 1087, William launched a campaign into Maine to defend his Norman interests. Despite his age and injuries sustained during previous conflicts, he led his forces with determination. During the siege of the town of Mantes, William was grievously wounded, some accounts say by a fall from his horse. His injury would prove fatal, marking the beginning of the end for the conqueror. William died on September 9, 1087, in Rouen, Normandy. His death plunged both England and Normandy into uncertainty. His body was interred at the Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen, a monumental church he had founded. Though his physical presence was gone, his influence endured, his reforms, castles, and laws shaping the kingdoms for generations. True to his plans, William's lands were divided among his sons. Robert received Normandy, William Rufus the English crown, and Henry was left with a smaller inheritance. This partition would fuel decades of rivalry, civil war, and shifting alliances, underscoring the fragile nature of medieval succession. Yet, despite these conflicts, William's dynasty would endure, molding the course of English and Norman history. William's reign transformed England irrevocably. From battlefield victor to master administrator, he forged a new political and cultural identity. His establishment of feudalism, introduction of Norman law, and monumental building projects altered the landscape and society. His legacy is a story of conquest, governance, and the forging of a kingdom that would become England. William was a man of contradictions, ruthless and just, fierce and pious, warrior and statesman. His vision shaped the medieval world, and his story echoes in the castles and cathedrals he left behind. The England he forged was born from conflict, but bound by law, a kingdom poised to grow into a great power. William the Conqueror's final years were the closing chapter of a reign that changed the course of history. His shadow looms large over the centuries, a testament to the enduring power of will, ambition, and legacy. The king who crossed the sea to claim a crown left a kingdom forever altered, and a story forever told. The conquest was over, the battles fought and won. Yet the true measure of William's reign lay not in bloodshed, but in the legacy he left behind. A legacy woven into the very fabric of England's identity. William the Conqueror changed England forever. But how? What did he give to a land that had been torn apart by war? And how does his story echo through the centuries, shaping the nation we know today? William's reign established the foundations of the medieval English state. By imposing Norman feudalism, he redefined land ownership and governance. The crown became the ultimate source of authority, binding nobles to the king through oaths and service. This centralization of power was revolutionary for England, creating a political system that endured for centuries. William's successors would build upon this foundation, eventually evolving into the English monarchy recognizable today. The Domesday Book, courts, and the appointment of loyal sheriffs introduced a new order of law and administration. Norman law blended with Anglo-Saxon customs, creating the roots of the English common law system. William's governance brought greater consistency, accountability, and royal oversight. These reforms laid the groundwork for a justice system that has influenced legal traditions worldwide. William's castle-building campaign forever altered England's landscape. Stone keeps like the Tower of London became symbols of power and security. Cathedrals and abbeys flourished, showcasing Norman architectural grandeur and religious fervor. The blending of Norman and Anglo-Saxon culture enriched English art, language, and society. The Norman French language influenced English vocabulary, especially in law, governance, and cuisine. Feudalism restructured society, creating new classes and redefining relationships between lords and peasants. Economic growth followed as towns expanded and trade networks developed under the stability Norman rule provided. Agricultural innovations and market charters encouraged prosperity. Though often harsh, Norman rule brought order that enabled England to flourish in the centuries to come. William's lineage shaped the future of England and Europe. His sons and descendants played pivotal roles in medieval history, from the Angevins to the Plantagenets. The succession struggles sparked by William's division of lands forged a complex web of alliances and conflicts that influenced politics for generations. His bloodline intertwined with royal houses across the continent, extending his legacy beyond England's shores. William's image has evolved through history, from ruthless conqueror to wise ruler, to a symbol of strength and order. The Bayeux Tapestry immortalizes his conquest, while chronicles and later historians debated his motives and methods. His reign became a benchmark in English history, a moment when the island was irrevocably changed. The stories, legends, and symbols of William continue to inspire, challenge, and provoke reflection. Today, William's legacy is evident in England's legal systems, language, architecture, and identity. His conquest is studied as a pivotal event that shaped medieval and modern Europe. Yet his reign also prompts questions about power, legitimacy, cultural change, and the costs of conquest. Understanding William the Conqueror is to understand the forces that forged a nation. William the Conqueror's story is not just of a man or a battle, but of transformation. A transformation that echoes through castles and laws, through language and lineage. He was a king who changed England forever, and his legacy remains alive in the heart of a nation, still shaped by his vision, his strength, and his indelible mark upon history.